everybody, it's 7 o'clock here in the UK. Very welcome to spend your breakfast with us here at Sky News. 568 days since the country first went into lockdown. A scathing report today reveals errors, failings and mistakes by ministers and their scientific advisors that cost thousands of lives during the pandemic. We'll be joined today to discuss this by the Cabinet Office Minister Stephen Barclay and also David Nabarro from the World Health Organization.
What we're asking is the organisations to recognise that the menopause can be an issue in the workplace.
Also this morning, fighting the tragic impact of the menopause in the workplace, as estimates say 900,000 women in the UK have quit their jobs because of it. We'll ask the gynaecologist, Dame Leslie Regan, what employers can do to help at 8:45. And
would you like some fruit on top of your porridge?
I hadn't had fruit on porridge before.
Okay. Do you want to try it for the first time? Yeah? All right, wicked.
from laying down lyrics to serving up cereal, joined by the rapper Professor Green, who's helping to fight food poverty by giving breakfast to primary school kids in East London. That's at 9:45. It's Tuesday, the 12th of October. The UK's most important public health failure ever. The damning new report, which finds serious errors by ministers and scientists, cost thousands of lives in the pandemic.
We know that some of that scientific advice was wrong, but also that politicians should have challenged that advice.
A warning from food retailers of price rises over the coming months following a deal to keep CO2 supplies secure.
I'm live in Dublin ahead of a very potentially frosty day with UK-EU relations at stake as Britain's top Brexit minister prepares to call on the bloc to make major changes to the Northern Ireland Protocol.
The Palma volcano continues to cause damage, with emergency services telling people to take shelter after lava destroys a cement factory. And exploring the challenges facing the economy as we come out of the pandemic, Sky News launches the first in a series of live in-person Big Ideas events around the country. And truth, justice and the quest for inclusivity. DC Comics reveals the latest incarnation of the Man of Steel is bisexual. That made you sit up and listen, didn't it? A very good morning to you. One of the UK's most important public health failures ever. That's the verdict of a damning new report which says thousands of lives were lost at the start of the COVID pandemic due to delays and mistakes made by ministers and their scientific advisors. It pinpoints decisions on going into lockdown too late and how care home residents were exposed. The government says throughout the pandemic it's been guided by the scientific and medical experts and never shied away from taking quick, decisive action. Our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, reports.
On a wall opposite Westminster, 150,000 hearts commemorate those lost to COVID. And today's report from MPs lays plenty of criticism for our pandemic failures at government's door. But it blames the science too.
We know that some of that scientific advice was wrong, but also that politicians should have challenged that advice. And there is never 100% certainty with scientific advice. So you can't just say we're following the science. You have to dig down and ask why scientists are saying what they're saying. That challenge should have happened earlier.
The report finds that decisions on lockdowns and social distancing during the early weeks of the pandemic rank as one of the most important public health failures the country has ever experienced. Specifically, it criticises the dominance of herd immunity as an idea, saying the UK made a serious early error in adopting this fatalistic approach. It highlights the failures in test and trace and protecting social care, which had devastating and preventable repercussions for people receiving care and their families. There's plenty of criticism to share around in this report between Westminster and the scientific advice it was given. But in terms of lessons learned, there are positives too. Take the NHS and how flexible it was in coping with the burden of disease, but also how it pioneered new research into COVID. And of course, there's all those vaccines. So far, COVID jabs have saved at least 120,000 lives, and the NHS proved it could adapt to save thousands more.
One thing, the good things I think that's come out of the pandemic is we've demonstrated that the National Health Service is the most agile institution in the United Kingdom. The NHS has survived, but in a very broken fashion. And the people who will suffer will be the people of the United Kingdom.
The object of this report, say MPs, is to learn lessons so we're prepared for the next global pandemic. But ensuring we've recovered from this one will have to come first. Tom Clark, Sky News.
Well, the Cabinet Office Minister and Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Stephen Barcley, is with us now. Hello, good morning. Thank you for joining us. I suppose you want to start with an apology to the British public.
We moved quickly in response to the vaccine. Obviously, this report has just come out, so we want to look at it and consider it. That's why we've also got an inquiry to ensure that where there are lessons to learn, we do so. But we followed throughout the scientific advice. We got the vaccine deployed extremely quickly. We protected our NHS from the surge of cases. But of course, if there are lessons to learn, we're keen to do so.
Keen to start with an apology, though, I would have thought.
Well, no, we followed the scientific advice. We protected,
so no apology?
We followed the scientific advice. We protected the NHS. We took the decisions based on the evidence before us. But of course, we've always said with something so unprecedented as the pandemic, there will be lessons to learn. We're keen to learn them. That's why we've committed to an inquiry. And that will be the opportunity to look at what could be done differently and what lessons we take into the future.
20,000 lives needlessly lost because you didn't lock down a week earlier and you don't want to apologise?
Well, the issue of the timing of the lockdown was based on the evidence and the scientific advice at the time. The concern was if we locked down too soon, there wouldn't be a willingness to lock down for a long period of time. Now, we actually know now that actually there was a willingness of the British public to lock down for far longer than we envisaged, but that reflects the unprecedented nature of the COVID pandemic, the fact that we know with hindsight different things to what we knew at the time. But it's right, Kay, that we look in the inquiry at what lessons there are to learn and ensure that we learn from them.
No apology that we were told by the then Health Secretary that there was a protective ring around care homes, and we know that that not to be the case.
Well, the decisions were taken on the evidence and the scientific advice at the time. They were taken to protect the NHS. The understanding of issues such as asymptomatic infection and how that spread the disease, we now know far more about that than we did in 2020 at the start of the pandemic. So I think the question for the inquiry will be, what information did the government have on something that was unprecedented? Were the decisions informed by the science at the time? And do we now know different things about the pandemic to what we knew in February in 2020? And of course, we've learned a huge amount, but we did take decisions to move quickly. That is why the vaccine was deployed at pace. That was a success that the report recognises. But this report only obviously came out at midnight. I'm very keen to read it, but we're going to have an inquiry to look at the lessons to take forward to the future.
You just took at face value what the scientists said and didn't challenge them?
No, I think there was rigorous debate within government with science, but of course it was unprecedented. So it was a developing picture for the scientists themselves. There were areas where I think the government has received credit for moving very quickly, such as with the vaccine deployment. We also moved very quickly to protect the NHS. We all recall the scenes in Italy where its health service came under massive strain, and we were very keen to avoid our own... For reasons we were very keen to avoid that happening to our NHS.
So
but of course, it was an unprecedented pandemic, Kay. We were learning about it as we went through. And of course, with hindsight, there's things we know about it now that we didn't know at the time. But we'll look at the report from the Health Select Committee and see what lessons can be taken forward.
I suppose my viewers this morning will find it difficult to comprehend that you sent care home residents back to their care homes from hospital when you knew that they had COVID and you didn't test care home workers.
Well, as I say, we're going to have an inquiry to look at the lessons. The principal concern at the time was around the surge of patients on the NHS, the concern around delayed discharge and how that would block up the capacity of the NHS. The understanding around asymptomatic infection was very different. We didn't have the testing regime that we now have. That had to be built from a standing start. So, of course, Kay, there are going to be lessons to learn. That's why we've committed to an inquiry. But the government took decisions at the time based on the scientific advice it received, but those scientists themselves were operating in a very new environment where they themselves were learning about the pandemic.
I don't understand why you don't want to apologise.
Well, there are lessons to learn, but the point is that we took decisions based on the science. We protected the NHS. We got the vaccine deployed at pace, but we accept where there are lessons to be learned, we're keen to do so.
Yeah, but you're representing the government this morning, and there were 20,000 unnecessary deaths in the United Kingdom, many of them elderly people, and you don't want to apologise.
Well, what I'm saying, Kay, is did we take decisions based on the scientific evidence we were protected?
Why don't
Did
you
we
just say,
save lives?
we're sorry?
Did we save lives through deploying the vaccine at pace far quicker than many comparable countries? Did we protect the NHS from the surge that had overwhelmed other health systems? Yes, we did. Now, were there consequences to those decisions? And what was the scientific advice we received? And did we make the right decisions? These are legitimate questions for the inquiry to get into. The report you're talking about came out at midnight. I've not had an opportunity to read it. I'm keen to do so. But this is why we have committed to an inquiry, so we can get the lessons
But
from
on
the
that
pandemic.
one fact, 20,000 needless deaths, according to the report, you don't need to go through the whole, hefty report in order to know that it says that 20,000 people died needlessly, many of them elderly and infirm. Are you not sorry about that?
Well, this is why we're taking decisions, for example, around
Why can't
social
you just
care
say, yes, we are
patients.
sorry?
Well, there will be lessons, and of course where there's lessons, we're keen to take that on board. The question you're asking is, in February, March of 2020, did we make logical decisions based on the advice we received? And the knowledge we had at that point on things like asymptomatic infections was very different to what we know now. Now, we've taken on board those lessons. That's why, for example, we've said that people need to be vaccinated if they're working in social care. It's why throughout the pandemic we had funding packages of support, such as the infection prevention control that went into social care. It's why, for example, we applied 11,000 iPads so we could get better data on exactly what was happening within the social care sector. But the fundamental point within your question is, are there lessons for us to learn from what happened at the pandemic?
That's not
and the
my
answer
question.
to that is we will learn the lessons.
Minister, that's not my question, with respect. What I'm saying is that 20,000 families watching this morning probably lost a loved one. They couldn't go to the funerals because either they weren't allowed at all, or there was an extended family and they couldn't all go. We saw a young man who was lowered into the ground and his family couldn't be there and they had to watch it on Zoom. 20,000 times that happened needlessly. How can you not say you're sorry?
Well, that is heartbreaking. That impact on families, that impact in terms of people's funerals is heartbreaking. And I think all of us feel that. All of us have friends and neighbours who were in that situation. I think in terms of the decisions that the government take, which is what this report is referring to, there were decisions we took on the vaccines to protect the NHS based on the knowledge we had at that point, which were logical decisions for the government to take. But we're keen to learn from that period. It was an unprecedented time. We were working with imperfect information, and it's important we take those inquiries, and that's why we've got an inquiry to look at that.
And was it logical to spend £37 billion on a test and trace system that didn't work?
Well, just a minute ago, you were saying that we should have done more to understand asymptomatic testing. That will no doubt be one of the factors in terms of what happened in social care, because it was the asymptomatic infections that played such a big part in the fatalities that we saw in the social care sector. That is exactly why, from a standing start, we built a test and taste capacity. Obviously, that took a huge amount of effort and
money,
cost.
£37
Indeed, it did.
billion.
A huge amount of cost.
And
but
the
on the
report
one
is saying
hand,
it was pointless. It wasn't fit for purpose. Are they just basically, coming up with this report with 20/20 hindsight, and it's easy for them to say?
Well, firstly, I haven't had a chance. The report came out at midnight, so I've not had a chance to read it. So obviously, I will need to do so. Secondly, I think if you speak to the leading medical advice in our country, they will not say that test and trace was pointless. In fact, they will say it's a key part of our armoury.
Not what the report say, which is what I'm putting to you this morning.
I'm saying if you speak to the chief medical officer, if you speak to the leading medics within our country, they will not say that test and trace is pointless. They will say it is an important part of the UK's controls against a repeat of what happened in our care homes. So you can't, on the one hand, say that we were wrong not to have controls around people going into care homes, and on the same time say that we were wrong to put in controls.
I'm not saying it, Minister. This is what the report is saying.
I'm just pointing to
pointing
to the contradiction in the question between, on the one hand, saying it's wrong to have
so
controls
you're saying
into
that the
care
report
homes.
is benefiting from 2020 hindsight?
Well, the report came out at midnight. I've not had a chance to read it.
No, but you knew you were on the telly
obviously
this morning, so I'm sure that your aides have pointed out the highlights for you.
So, well, I'm keen to read it, and we will engage with it, and the inquiry, I'm sure, will consider the points that are in it. What you're saying is that the report thinks that test and trace is pointless. That is not the
No, what
view.
they said was it was £37 billion was a waste.
But it was hugely expensive, and as a former Treasury Minister, I absolutely recognise it was very expensive. But value for money at a time when national crisis changes, and we were doing everything we could in order to put in controls so we could better protect people and learn from the early lessons of the pandemic.
OK, let's move on to Brexit, should we? An area that you know an awful lot about. The EU, it would appear, actually giving in and offering up some changes that they say they have been working on for some time to try and sort out the logjam with the Northern Ireland Protocol to make trade easier. Lord Frost giving a speech in Lisbon, I think, later on today, saying it's not good enough. We've not actually heard what they're going to say yet.
Well, he's giving a speech, so obviously I don't want to preempt that. But I don't see it as the EU giving in or one side giving in. I think there's a recognition on both sides that the protocol needs to work for both communities in Northern Ireland. The whole underpinning of the Good Friday Agreement, which both sides are deeply committed to, is based on the consent of both communities. And I think there's a recognition on both sides that the protocol is not working. And so what Lord Frost will be talking about is very sensible proposals that the British government set out through our command paper as to how we can better ensure that the protocol is fit for the purpose and sustainable in a long-term way.
Is it trade that we're worried about, sausage wars, as it's been used as shorthand in many of the newspapers, or is it the involvement of the European courts, them overseeing the protocols in Northern Ireland, that we're most concerned about as a country?
Well, it's both. I think the governance matters.
Because we were told it was trade wars for a long time, weren't we? And now we were hearing about the European Court.
No, it's both. I think it's both in terms of how trade and businesses are affected, but it's also the governance as well and the imbalance of that. But more fundamentally, it's about both communities viewing the protocol as sustainable in the long term. And I think that's the issue, because that really goes back to what I think shapes the views of both sides. Both sides are committed to the Good Friday Agreement. Both sides want to ensure that that is protected. And we need a protocol that is sustainable in the long term. And that's really what Lord Frost will be addressing today.
And just a quick thought, I know you've got to go. Quite a few supermarkets and food production companies are warning that people shouldn't panic buy, and there are some concerns about what's going to happen ahead of Christmas, and the shelves are going to be empty in supermarkets. I suppose you would reiterate their comments that people
I would. And I think people should just remember the start of the pandemic, when our supply chains came under huge strain and they saw the resilience of the UK retail sector. The government is working very closely with industry. We brought Sir Dave Lewis, the former chief exec of Tesco, into the heart of government to liaise with the industry. We're responding to a number of industry requests. And we do have an extremely resilient food sector within the UK. And what happened with petrol was driven by a consumer reaction. There was actually more deliveries than sales going into forecourts. That has stabilised, but we are working very actively with industry, and people like Sir Dave Lewis is helping with that liaison.
Yeah, Prime Minister enjoying a few days away at the moment with his young family. You must be quite envious you've not had a break this year.
Well, it's quite right. The Prime Minister, given that I think all of your viewers, Kay, would recognise the job of Prime Minister is a hugely demanding one. And I think people recognise that it's also important that our leaders, our Prime Minister, is able to get refreshed and come back to the parliamentary term next week. I don't think people will begrudge him that.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying you must be a little tiny bit envious given that you've not had a break.
I think the demands of a Prime Minister are extremely hard, and it's quite right that he has a break.
OK, it's good to talk to you. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, Barkley. Thank you. And just a reminder, if you want to catch up on any of that interview or watch the programme when you're out and about this morning, then, of course, you can find us on the mobile app. Or you can go to our website and go into our live blog to watch the programme. And you can catch up on the interviews on my Twitter feed as well. That's @KBurley. Now, there's a warning this morning from the British Retail Consortium that food prices could rise off the back of a deal to secure CO2 supplies until Christmas. Just talking about that with the Minister, weren't we? Charlotte Lomas is in West London and joins us now. Hello to you, Charlotte. A very good morning. What sort of concerns are there where you are this morning?
Good morning, Kay. Well, retailers have welcomed that deal brokered by the government to secure CO2 supplies until after Christmas, but they're also highlighting that there's just another cost pressure for them among many that they're experiencing at the moment. This should, of course, be one of the biggest and best time for the high street as we approach Christmas, but instead they're really feeling, retailers, the impact of labour shortages, of the energy crisis, and of course the issues with the supply chain. And there's a warning that it's going to start filtering through and that consumers might start feeling the impact of that, with a warning, as you say, Kay, from the British Retail Consortium, who've carried out a survey among its members, and 3 of 5 retailers now are saying they're expecting to have to increase prices over the coming months. And this comes also as consumer confidence has slumped. We know from the British Retail Consortium that it's been the weakest performance this September since January, and that was when the UK was experiencing heavy lockdown restrictions. So the retailers are asking now the government to really expand the scope and size of the new visa scheme to try and help in the short term.
OK, Charlotte, thank you. Thanks a lot. Also talking with the Minister about the government's top Brexit aide, who is expected to say today that the arrangement made in January 2020 between the UK and the EU around Northern Ireland needs significant change if it's to be sustainable. Minister wouldn't talk about it in much detail. Stephen standing by for us this morning. Hello to you, Stephen. So what's being discussed? What is the EU going to do about it?
Hi, Kay. Well, I mean, you heard fairly soothing and restrained words there from Steve Barclay, although he didn't want to preempt this speech. So essentially, Lord Frost, David Frost, Britain's top Brexit minister, is giving a speech in Lisbon and Portugal later on this afternoon, in which he's expected to outline Britain's demands for major changes and major concessions from the European Union over the controversial Northern Ireland protocol. That's caused a lot of angst and anxiety here in Dublin and in the other European capitals as well, because Maros Sefcovic, who's the Vice President of the European Commission, is due tomorrow to outline at least 4 different ranges of concessions or compromises that the European Union feel will address all the concerns from the British side and from the Unionist side in Northern Ireland over the working of the protocol as well. So they see the British as essentially shifting the goalposts. That's the phrase that Simon Coveney, who's the Irish Foreign Minister, used. And I mean, it doesn't set a great background for this week's events when we saw over the weekend Simon Coveney and David Frost sniping at each other on Twitter. Simon Coveney taking to Twitter at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night to say that questioning whether the UK government even wants to have a deal at all. So here's a quick reminder about what all of this is about. As many of you will remember, during the post-Brexit trade talks, the Northern Ireland border with the Republic of Ireland was a major bone of contention, a major difficulty. And the Northern Ireland Protocol was brought in the eventual agreement to try and deal with that. It allows for goods to move freely between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, avoiding any kind of a hard border on the island. But the EU custom rules still apply in Northern Ireland. And Article 16 then, which we're going to hear a lot about, is part of the protocol. And it allows the UK or the EU to suspend aspects of the protocol if either side, and this is the technical language, considers that it is causing economic, societal or environmental difficulties or diversion of trade. But of course, this should only be used as very much as a last resort and in the face of serious problems when both sides are unable to agree on a joint approach to solving those sort of issues. And if one side does go ahead and trigger Article 16, the other side can take rebalancing action in response. In real terms, neither side really wants to go down that route, and certainly up until now, sources in the Irish government here always firmly believe that the British government does want to get some sort of a deal. It's just that they're very good at hiding it, because essentially the British approach to these negotiations has always been a bit more unpredictable, a bit more wildcard than the EU's traditional plodding and methodical approach. So it's budget day here in Ireland, plenty of distractions, but the government will be keeping a very close eye, as they will in Brussels as well, on what Lord Frost says in Portugal later this afternoon.
Stephen, you started your report there by giving us a very big sigh. Just how frustrating is the situation for the people in Dublin and wider Ireland?
He's a very calm, rational, diplomatic kind of man. I was listening to him being interviewed on national radio here yesterday morning. You could really sense that kind of, if I'm sighing, he was certainly sighing, and that frustration, if it's that evident emanating from Simon Coveney, it does give you a little bit of an insight into the frustration felt here in Dublin and presumably many of the other EU 27 capitals as well.
OK, Simon, forgive me. Stephen, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. What else is coming up on the programme for you this morning? 7:30, speaking to a driving school boss about the backlog causing hundreds of thousands of learners to wait up to half a year to take their test. 7:45, speak to a former UN Assistant Secretary General who was stationed in Kabul about the G20 meeting due to take place today to discuss the situation in Afghanistan. And at 8:05, speaking to the Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury, that's James Murray, to get Labour's view on the report into the lessons learned from the government's handling of the pandemic. Now, people living on the island of La Palma have been told to remain indoors after the volcano, which has been spewing lava and ash for almost a month, engulfed a cement plant. The destruction of the plant was highlighted here on Sky News yesterday. Volcano has so far destroyed nearly 600 hectares of land and more than 1,000 buildings. 6,000 people have been evacuated from their homes. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines for you this morning. The president of COP26 says world leaders must deliver on their promises to curb dangerous climate change at the talks in Glasgow. In a speech later today, Alok Sharma will call for leaders to honour the Paris Agreement, which committed countries to trying to limit global temperature rises to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius in order to keep the goal alive. And looking at our climate dashboard, you can see that according to our scientists, it's going to be 11 years, the time left to try to make sure that the global temperatures since 1880 do not reach 1.5 degrees higher. And we're using 45% of fossil fuels in our retail power mix this morning. And a reminder, you can get all the latest on the Sky News Daily Climate Show, which airs every weekday evening at 6:30. At least 2 people have died and another 2 were injured when a small plane crashed in a residential area of San Diego. Witnesses say an elderly couple were rescued from a home in the suburb of Santee, while at least 3 other homes sustained significant damage. It's not known where the plane was headed or how many people were on board. Latest unemployment figures, and the number of UK workers on payrolls rose by 207,000 between August and September to a record 29.2 million, which is back to levels seen before the pandemic struck. That's according to figures from the official office, for National Statistics. Later today, Sky News will launch the first in a series of in-person events, Big Ideas Live, bringing together our specialists, key stakeholders and regional communities to discuss the pressing issues of our time. This week, we'll focus on jobs and the economy. Our business presenter, Ian, is up in Rotherham for us. Hi, Ian. Good morning, bright and early. So tell us what the plan is for where you are this morning.
Hello, Kay. Yes, welcome from the Magna Science Park here at the old Temporal Steelworks in Rotherham, where we're hosting the first event, as you described it, Sky News Big Ideas Live. Now, this is the first in what is described as a series of thought leadership events where we're going to be trying to get our arms around and tackle some of the big issues of the day. And as you said, the focus here is all about jobs. My programme, Ian King Live, will be coming from here live at 10 o'clock this morning in front of a live invited audience of business people, academics and other people who are interested in the economic recovery. We'll be discussing how we create jobs post-pandemic, how the UK fires up its economy, gets the best out of the recovery as possible. We'll also be looking at the opportunities provided by the transition away from fossil fuels, green jobs, and we'll also be talking about a specific focus here on the north of England as well, and the kind of role that the north of England is going to play. You may recall, of course, George Osborne, the former Chancellor, used to talk a lot about the Northern Powerhouse. It kind of died away when he and David Cameron left office, really. So we'll be trying to explore that as well. We've got a host of big names coming to join us. For example, I'll be joined by the boss of Siemens UK, Carl Ennis, and Lord Bill Amoria, the president of the CBI. Later on, we'll be hearing from Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England. And as I say, there will be lots of audience participation here live. Viewers can get involved as well, viewers at home, by getting in touch on hashtag Sky News Big Ideas Live, hashtag Big Ideas Live. They can send in their questions to our panellists, and we will be dipping in and out throughout the day here on Sky News. There'll be coverage, as I say, at 10 o'clock this morning, and then later on at 11:30, and the whole thing will be streamed live on Sky's various digital platforms as well. So lots of exciting things going on here today, and lots of opportunities for the viewers at home to get involved as well.
OK, lovely. Thanks so much indeed, Ian. Thanks mentioning Mark Carney there. Our colleague Sam Washington interviewing him later on this morning. You'll be able to see that here on Sky News. As Ian was saying, the Big Ideas Live will be streamed on the website and social channels throughout the day. And you can get involved yourself, if you'd like to, by submitting questions to the panels using that hashtag, as Ian was saying, Big Ideas Live. Now, could the first rocket launch from the UK be fast approaching? Skyaura has signed a deal to blast off rockets like this from Shetland. It's a multi-launch deal over the next decade, which could send satellites into orbit from 2022. It's hoped the spaceport on Shetland would create an additional 140 jobs once operational. Is it going to go up? Maybe. Hundreds of thousands of learner drivers talking about them. They are having to wait up to half a year to sit their test because of delays caused by the pandemic. I'm going to be speaking to a driving school boss after the break. Hello, everybody. A damning cross-party report from MPs this morning says thousands of lives were lost due to delays and mistakes made at the start of the COVID pandemic by both ministers and indeed their scientific advisors. Earlier, I was joined by the Cabinet Office Minister Steve Barclay. I asked him if he'd like to apologise on behalf of the government for all of the unnecessary deaths. Have a listen to what he said.
We followed throughout the scientific advice. We got the vaccine deployed extremely quickly. We protected our NHS from the surge of cases. But of course, if there are lessons to learn, we're keen to do so.
Keen to start with an apology, though, I would have thought.
Well, no, we followed the scientific advice. We protected,
so no apology?
We followed the scientific advice. We protected the NHS. We took the decisions based on the evidence before us. But of course, we've always said, with something so unprecedented as the pandemic, there will be lessons to learn.
Tamara's here. Tamara, I think I gave him the opportunity at least 8 times to apologise.
Yes, I counted 8 times, and the response from Steve Barclay was essentially that he will get round to reading it, the government will take what these two committees, the Health and Science Committees of the House of Commons, both chaired by Conservative MPs, incidentally, they will take it on board. And when we have that full public inquiry that the Prime Minister has promised next spring, which we're going to hear from the bereaved families, and we're going to hear in a lot more detail about what happened at every stage, the government will take this into account. But I think what really came through is this is the first proper full assessment of what went wrong. They interviewed all the key players, Matt Hancock, Dominic Cummings, people who were in number 10 in the room at the time these decisions were being taken. And what really comes through is that they feel that although it's not pointing the finger at any individuals, this isn't an individual sort of call to resign moment, the whole system failed. They didn't challenge some of the scientists' advice. They didn't lock down early enough. And particularly that protective ring around care homes was not what they say what happened, and it doesn't seem that the government wants at this stage to take any responsibility for any of those failings. And I'm sure people who were affected by that watching the interview will have found that very jarring.
I'm sure a lot of people watching this morning would have been throwing things at the telly when I offered the opportunity to apologise. We apologise for the loss of life. We didn't get an apology.
Yes, and Steve Barclay says, of course, there were lessons to learn. He points out we've gone a lot of this is old ground that we've raked over before. Why did we not lock down earlier last March? Because the government thought that if you did it too early, then the public wouldn't comply with it. And we now know that people did comply with it very well over a long period. So, as he says, we live and learn. But Boris Johnson said last summer that he took full responsibility for all the decisions made during the pandemic. His minister today didn't seem to want to get into some of the government's failings, which are very glaring in this report. The report says that this was one of the worst public health failures the UK has ever seen. And there is an immense amount to learn from it, which needs to be learned right now because we're still in the pandemic and we may face another one in the not too distant future.
And sorry seems to be the hardest word.
Indeed.
Thanks very much, Tamara. Tomorrow's take at 9 o'clock this morning. Thank you. Now, let's move on to... Do you remember when you took your test? Do you remember when you took your test?
I took quite a few tests, actually, Kay.
Did you? How many did you take?
Oh, maybe about 5.
Did you? Did you really?
Over a longish period.
Oh, wow. OK. I don't know what to say to that, so I'll just move on. Qualities lie elsewhere. Anyway, people who are waiting to take their test, some 400,000 are having to wait up to 6 months to take those tests due to a backlog caused by the pandemic. Joined now by the Chief Executive of Red Driving School, that's Ian McIntosh. Mr McIntosh, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the programme this morning. Just how bad is it for learner drivers at the moment?
Good morning. Yes, that's quite a challenge, isn't it, to potentially have to wait that long for a test. But I would argue that you plan ahead here and you work with your driving instructor to a programme and book your test in advance. There is a chance then that you might pass first time and it won't be a problem at all. But it is a huge problem that there is such a big backlog. And I know the DVSA are doing a number of things to try and reduce that backlog.
What's caused it?
Well, the problem is that we were shut down for something like there were no driving lessons for over 250 days. It was even longer in terms of no testing. And there are 2,000 new 17-year-olds every day entering the market, in effect. So there's this constant demand for lessons and for driving tests. And of course, there was no testing going on during those 3 lockdowns that we had during 2020. So it's hardly surprising that there is a big backlog. The challenge now is how does the industry overcome this backlog and get back to something like a reasonable wait for a test?
Which was going to be my next question. What's the answer?
Well, it's a little bit up to the DVSA in a sense. I know they're trying a number of things. They're planning to shave 5 minutes off the test, hopefully by not reducing the standard of the test. They're trying to buy back time from examiners so that they don't go on holiday, so buy back leave. They're using all qualified examiners in their business or in their organisation that perhaps normally don't do driving tests, so that will add a bit more capacity. They're recruiting and training more examiners, but that will take time. And they're hoping to move to 8 tests a day per examiner. But that's been resisted a little bit by the public sector union. But thankfully, we've just avoided a strike, which would have been today and yesterday by the PSU. So that's still to be negotiated, I think. That change hasn't happened yet. But the DVSA are working hard to try and deal with that backlog, although, of course, I'm not a spokesman for the DVSA, but this is what I've been told.
So kids who are turning 17 today, parents as well watching this morning, what sort of advice would you give to them? I remember when my son turned 17, he'd already applied for his test that would be his theory test. Yes. Came on his 17th birthday, so he could then apply for his other test after that once he'd passed. It's quite a complex route, isn't it, for young people?
It is, but, lives are at stake and we don't want anybody on the road who's not properly qualified, and especially not our youngsters. I'm sure none of us want our children to wing the test, pass it and find they're not actually capable of driving safely. So it's important that we do this properly. My advice certainly would be to plan with an instructor your journey. Don't apply for a test on one of these cancellation websites and then expect somebody to take you to the test because you're not going to find anybody. The industry is super busy. We've never been busier. So plan ahead with an instructor, plan that date in your diary and work towards it. And of course, do all you can to make sure that you go to that test ready. That is also good advice from the DVSA, that they are saying, please bring candidates to test who are test ready, because if you pass, then you don't have to worry about the backlog. If you fail, you might have a long wait for a resit. So plan ahead and prepare properly.
OK, what are your top tips for passing first time? I don't know if you heard there, Tamara saying that she'd taken her test 5 times.
Yes, well, I don't know the circumstances of her situation, but the training is designed to make people competent, safe drivers. So there are fewer maneuvers these days. It's all about following that sat nav for 20 minutes and demonstrating that you're a safe driver. The only way you're going to do that confidently is lots of practice, lots of training. So it becomes automatic, like it is for us experienced drivers. You hardly think about driving when you're driving. That's the state of mind you need to get to. If you do that, you'll wing the test, no problem at all.
OK, did you pass first time yourself?
Well, I didn't, but it was a long time ago to be fair. I passed second time. I think it was 1976 or something like that.
OK, so, I took my test in 1978, I think. So you passed just before? Yeah, I passed first time, just saying. It's nice to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. McIntosh, this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
The only test I ever passed. Now, cast your minds back to when the silver screen brought us one of the most famous incarnations of the last son of Krypton.
Excuse me.
Well, the latest incarnation of Superman will be bisexual in a future comic book. John Kent, the son of Clark Kent, and Lois Lane will fall for a reporter named Jay in what DC Comics is calling a bold new direction. Those working on the character say they feel honoured to see that the Man of Steel is now standing for something more than hope, truth and justice.
There are so many people reaching out in so many different languages saying what this means to them. I'm seeing tweets of people saying that they burst into tears when they read the news, that they wished that Superman was this when they were growing up, that they could see themselves, and people saying for the first time ever they're seeing themselves in Superman, something they never thought was possible.
So there now, a G20 meeting due to take place today to discuss the situation in Afghanistan. We're going to be speaking to a former UN Assistant Secretary General in just a moment.
Hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced and are affected. And most of them, of course, are living in awful conditions, and hence the appeal from IOM, the International Organization for Migration, in respect of the types of stories that we are hearing from IDPs. As you can imagine, as internally displaced persons, they've lost absolutely everything, having to flee their homes and found themselves in these unimaginable circumstances, many of them living in dilapidated settings. I was in Tigray earlier this year, and you had thousands of people living in schools, disused buildings, some sleeping out in the open and exposed obviously to all the elements of changing weather, etc., etc. So the testimonies that we hear from the IDPs are extremely difficult and sad stories. Many of the settings in which they are living in can no longer be sustained, or the resources are running out to maintain those settings. So for instance, what you have is people huddled in very small and cramped places. There is very little access to water and sanitation. Obviously, people need access to clean water, to showers, to keeping clean. There is an issue around access to health services. We have situations of pregnant and lactating women, children obviously who need nutritional help and support, and also the psychological and emotional impact of the crisis. The $21 million that IOM, the International Organization for Migration, is appealing for only is to respond to the urgent need for new shelter and relocating internally displaced people from some of the very difficult and dilapidated settings they're in to new shelter. Now, IOM has in the last few weeks been able to relocate around 3,000 families, but it is very far from addressing the whole crisis. Earlier in the year, in July, IOM launched an appeal for around $70 million US dollars, and most of the funds that we need still have not been met.
We don't understand that every lake or a pond is a habitat in itself, which houses frogs, snakes, crabs, turtles, birds, so many different life forms. Human beings directly depend on underground water source. So a lake or a pond is necessary to replenish these groundwater resources.
UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has warned that Afghanistan is facing a make-or-break moment ahead of a special summit of the group of 20 major economies later today to discuss the situation in the country. Italy holds the rotating G20 presidency this year, and the Prime Minister has called the meeting in an effort to get the international community to set a strategy to prevent Afghanistan becoming a haven for militants. Joining us now is Toby Lanza, former UN Secretary-General who was stationed in Afghanistan until June of last year. Hello to you. Thank you for joining us on the programme this morning, Mr. Lanza. What can we reasonably expect to be achieved from this meeting?
I think it's an important moment for the G20, a group of economically rich countries and politically influential countries, to get together and, to a large extent, get beyond the emotion associated with the way in which things fell apart in Afghanistan just 2 months ago, and to focus on some of the key issues which confront all of us, whether we like it or not. And those include the fight against terror. And ironically, we're going to have to engage with the Taliban because at the moment they are the only power on the ground in Afghanistan who can confront ISIS. It's going to include a conversation, I hope, about rights, in particular of women, and about aid and engaging to support the population there.
Should the Taliban have been invited to the table?
No, the Taliban have not been invited to the table, and I think that would have been very unusual, and I would never have expected it. But I think that what all the leaders of the G20 need to recognise now is that, without actually stating that the Taliban is a legitimate government per se, for operational reasons, there is every need to engage with the Taliban on a day-to-day basis. And I think increasingly now that's starting to happen. And that is a good thing if indeed the United Kingdom and other countries wish to stay engaged in a very important part of the world. Remember that Afghanistan is just south of Russia, just west of China, east of Iran, and north of Pakistan and India. So this is a crucial part of the world, and the UK and other countries in the West certainly want to stay engaged.
And to that end, British politicians negotiating, certainly meeting with the Taliban yesterday in a neutral country in the Middle East, illustrating just how important the British think it is to have that dialogue with the Taliban. The Americans feeling the same way. You have obviously had dealings with the Taliban, given that you have worked in the country previously. What's your view?
Well, I dealt with the Taliban for over 3 years on a very regular basis, both outside the country and inside the country. And I have to say, and this may sound unusual, but it's a group with whom one can have a conversation and where there is a certain amount of clarity. I am not surprised by some of the measures that the Taliban are taking at the moment, including preventing teenage girls from attending school. This is something that none of us want to see, but we need to engage in a conversation with the Taliban on that type of an issue. And if we stay away, we can't. So whether it's Britain, the United States, or other countries, having regular contact with the Taliban, both in Kabul eventually and outside the country, is going to be very important, especially on the question of rights, but also on aid, which one could see as a certain carrot, if you will. But definitely on this question of fighting ISIS, which has a local affiliate in Afghanistan, which could eventually create real havoc near and far.
But can the Taliban be taken at their word? It would appear they made a series of promises and undertakings in August, and many of them already falling apart.
I think it's important for us to test their word and not be terribly surprised when they take measures such as preventing teenage girls from going to school. But I would say that during my time in Kabul, in the capital of Afghanistan, and I was there for well over 3 years, my experience was that on key issues of security, and at the end of the day, our security in Britain, the security of Europe writ large, overrides all else. And on key issues, the Taliban, ironically, will now become a partner for the West in this battle against possibly resurgent IS on the ground in Afghanistan. And that needs to be prevented at all costs. So we will test the Taliban at their word on some of these key issues. And the only way to do that is by engaging in a conversation. I would say that when it comes to aid, the Taliban will be desperate for it, and I would never suggest that we start handing over money to the Taliban itself, but supporting key United Nations agencies such as the World Food Programme, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and indeed key aid agencies such as Save the Children from the UK, supporting them to help the people of Afghanistan is going to be very important. 40 million people, half of whom are hungry, half of all children under the age of 5 are suffering from acute malnutrition. You know, ignoring Afghanistan really isn't on the cards, and we're going to have to talk to the Taliban whether we like it or not.
Mr. Lanza, thank you very much indeed for your expertise this morning. We do appreciate it, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
Coming up in the next hour, if you missed it, you'll definitely want to catch our interview with the government minister this morning, reacting to a report, a scathing report about the way that the government dealt with the pandemic. I asked if he wanted to apologise for unnecessary deaths 11 times. 11 times he didn't. Stay tuned.